So here we are diving into our fourth lesson of the series. You can find that in the lesson 1-4 folder of your project files folder. And inside there is an After Effects project called 4-motion. You can just double click on it to launch it, or you can also drag and drop directly to the icon of After Effects if you like. Or if you have multiple copies on your machine and want to make sure that you open it up on the right copy of After Effects, as is my case here. So here we go. Launches quickly. I love a fast machine. Boy, that's fast compared to the old days. And let's talk about motion. We'll talk about motion by opening up our space scene. For after all, where is motion more important than in space? What with all that Newtonian and Galilean and Keplerian stuff going on, you know? Motion's important. So we're going to discuss motion by animating this little egg-shaped ship around our space scene. And our space scene happens to be this little Art Beats space movie. Rotating Earth. Isn't that nice? Now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, is that Earth? Because if it is, isn't it rotating in the wrong direction? Yeah, see? I knew what you were thinking. Well, actually, you probably weren't, but I was, because I actually got busted for a CNN commercial once where I had the Earth rotating in the wrong direction. So I'm sensitive about things like this. We'll correct the rotational speed of this, assuming it's Earth a little bit later. But for now, I'm going to concentrate on our egg. This is simply a Photoshop layer, something I threw together rather quickly with a few transfer modes and a couple of tools and the liquify, I think. And we're going to animate this moving around the screen. And by doing so, we're going to learn what we can learn about motion paths and After Effects. This is a pretty good position to start. Position is a key word here, of course. Motion, after all, is all about the values that occur between positions, right? You got to move from one position to another. You got to have motion. So in After Effects, creating motion is all about setting keyframes for position. Let's start that by tapping the letter P. That will solo our position property down here in the timeline. We'll jump back to frame 0 because we don't want to start our animation 10 seconds into this clip. And we'll set a keyframe for position by, once again, turning on our stopwatch. You should know how to do this by now, but just in case, I'm going to still point out everything that we do. And we'll move a little further down the timeline, maybe a second or so. It doesn't have to be precise. And I'll drag our ship over to the right-hand side of the screen. And notice as I drag, I'm leaving sort of a string behind me, a rubber band. I'm tied to my initial position by this dotted line. Well, that dotted line is our motion path. And by default, with 2 keyframes, that motion path is absolutely straight. And the dots that you see there represent the frames. But we'll come back to that in just a second. Let me let it go. We'll move another second or so in the timeline. Again, we don't really care that much about precision time alignment at this point. And we're going to drag our element now into the lower left-hand corner and look at what's happened to our path. What used to be a straight line has become a curved line. I mean, it's still coming out of this thing straight, but as soon as it gets anywhere close to the center point that we set a second ago, it starts to curve, and it curves through the second point down to the new point that we've created. Well, that's because After Effects' default behavior for motion paths is to create smooth motion paths. It's to create automatic Bezier shapes in its motion paths. And you'll see this extra little dot floating out here. You might actually mistake this for a star on this starry background, but it's not a star. This is actually a Bezier handle. And if I click on this keyframe, you'll see there are 2 Bezier handles, one on either side of the keyframe. And like any other Bezier handle, in any other application, you just click and drag these handles to control the shape of the path. So by default, motion in After Effects is created on these smooth Bezier paths, and the results that you see are smooth motion. Now, of course, if you don't like smooth motion, After Effects gives you ways to create linear motion, but we'll talk about that in just a second. For now, I just want to very, very briefly tell you what's going on with the Bezier path. For those of you who aren't familiar with the concept of a Bezier curve, in our case, our keyframes are marking what are known as nodes in the Bezier world. A node is a specific value. The handle that you see coming out of the node basically is controlling the acceleration of the line in the direction of the handle. So the further I draw the handle out, the more prone this line is to come in the direction of the handle. It then eventually, gradually gets taken over by the next handle, and the results are you get curves. You pull these handles out, and you get curvier curves. Make the handles really short, and you get these very, very slight curves just creeping out of our control points. Working with Beziers is really an essential part of creating smooth graphics, not only motion in After Effects, but masks in After Effects, and objects in Illustrator, and vector objects in Photoshop. Beziers are incredibly important to get to know how to use. And if you want to know a lot more about Beziers and getting the most out of Beziers, I highly recommend either our Illustrator series by Deke McClelland or our Photoshop series by Deke McClelland, both of which go into great depth on Beziers. But for now, we're going to basically just click and drag things around to create kind of a fun little path here. And let's talk a little bit about these dots that we're seeing. Each and every one of these dots represents a frame in After Effects. We start out at frame 0. The next dot out is frame 1. The next dot out is frame 2, etc. So the distance that we're seeing between these dots is actually providing us a visual hint for the speed of our animation. This can be very important. The speed of something is entirely based on a very, very simple formula. Speed is represented by distance over time. The most obvious example of this is miles per hour. That's a speed. Feet per second. That's a speed. Well, feet is a distance, second is time. So distance over time tells you the speed of your object. A very common question of newcomers to After Effects is, okay, I've got my path drawn the way I want it, but I don't like the speed. How do I make it faster? How do I make it slower? Well, the only way to make something go faster in an animation is to either increase the distance that it has to travel in the same period of time or decrease the amount of time that it takes to get where it's going. We can look at examples of both of these. If we just jump back to frame 0, you can see we're moving at a pretty consistent speed there. Let me actually create a work area down here so that we can give ourselves some room to work. I'll just set an end point at about 5 seconds. And we've got our keyframes here ending at just a little over 2 seconds. What that gives us, if we RAM preview that, is pretty smooth, pretty constant motion. Now, if I take and move these keyframes way apart from each other, and you can do that just by clicking and dragging a keyframe. We don't actually have to move the time marker if we don't want to back to frame 0, although it's safer to do that. You can, however, actually click and drag a keyframe. Note that when I'm moving this, that the dots are getting further apart. Dots that are far apart are telling you that you've got faster motion because with each frame you're going a little bit further. So if I move this one way far apart, jump to my last keyframe. I'm not quite on it right now, so I'm going to hit the J key to jump to that visible keyframe. And drag my last keyframe much closer to the center frame that I had before, you're going to see that because we're traveling a greater distance here and a shorter distance here, that this will be faster than it was before and this will be slower than it was before. There's our RAM preview. First half is faster, second half is slower. So distance is a very important factor in how fast something moves. Let me undo those adjustments to get us back to where we were going to go. The other option that you have is to actually change the timing of your keyframes if you want to change the speed of your animation. If instead of moving our objects on screen, we actually adjusted the position of the keyframes in the timeline, we can also adjust the speed of our object. So a nice way to do this globally is to select all of the keyframes that we want to affect, and then you can hold the Alt key down on Windows or the Option key on Mac and click on any keyframe that's at the end of a selection of keyframes. I could select the beginning one if I wanted to, but we're going to select the end and drag. And by holding the Alt key down on Windows, Option on Mac, we can actually scale the timing of the keyframes. And if I scale this all the way out to 5 seconds, watch what happens in the comp window when I let the keyframes go. There we are. Look at how close our dots have gotten together. Now our time marker stayed the same, so our ship has only moved halfway through its animation, but the line is so dense it almost looks like a solid line now. And if we RAM preview this, we're going to see much, much slower motion once the preview loads into RAM. We've now got a drifting ship. And once again, if we want to speed things up, let's go down the timeline. We'll just hold the Alt key down on Mac, Option on Windows, and drag it so that they're closer together. And when I let that go, you'll see the dots move very far apart, telling us that we have very fast motion. So where you place your keyframes in the timeline are as important as where you place them on the screen when you're trying to control the speed of an object. Let me jump to 3 seconds real quick. Shift page up a few times. There we are. And now I'm going to Alt, drag, and hold the Shift key down, and that'll snap this keyframe to our current time marker so I can precisely enforce this move to be a 3-second move. And let's talk a little bit about rotation when it comes to position. sometimes you'll be moving something around on screen and its rotation won't matter. Maybe you're doing a move on a piece of text and you want it to always be legible, so it's just going to fly in always horizontal and it doesn't really matter. But in the case of this object, it very clearly has a front end and a back end. Unless this is some kind of wacky alien technology where things don't fly with their fins pointed backwards, we need to find a way to coordinate this ship so that it points in the direction that it's flying. So let me simplify this path a little bit and talk about some basics of coordinating rotation with motion. If I go back to our first frame, we're going to add rotation now to what we're doing. So let me hold the Shift key down and type the letter R. So now we can see our rotational property. Now I'm going to start throwing in occasional power keyboard shortcuts here to speed things up a bit. For example, a second ago I rotated down position and clicked on the stopwatch for position to set a keyframe. What a waste of time. Because once you know the letter R for rotation, all you have to do is add the Alt key to it on Windows or the Option key on Mac to set a keyframe for that property. So if I just hold down the Alt key and tap R, I will set a keyframe for R wherever I am without doing anything else. Don't ever have to click on the stopwatch again. Isn't that easy? So now that my rotation is visible here in the timeline, I'm just going to scrub this rotational value. Once again, love these scrub values because they mean I don't have to go find my rotate tool or remember the keyboard shortcut for it, even though it's easy. And start out with our ship pointing in the direction we need it to. And I know that we're going to want our ship ending pointed in the other direction down here at the end of our path. So let's just jump to the end. Hold the Shift key down again to snap to keyframes. That'll take us there, and we'll snap there. Now let me rotate again this around until it points in the other direction. And that should take care of it, right? Well, not quite. Take a look at what this leaves us with. Not a very realistic rotation, frankly. And the problem is the rotation is happening linearly from one value to another, but the path is not a linear curve. This isn't a bisected portion of a circle here. This is a big blobby curve that comes out where not a lot of rotation happens at the beginning, and only when we get close to the real bendy portion of our path do we even start to turn at all. In cases like this, you can usually get away with actually not having any rotational keyframes at all beyond the first set keyframe until you get really close to the main bend in the curve. So if I move our time marker out here and then just adjust my keyframe over to that marker and let go, and then go to where we're just past the curve and drag in that other keyframe marker, that'll give us slightly more satisfactory results. A little more realistic. But even this is tedious. I mean, this is all fine, it's all well, it's all good for something as simple as this. But let me delete these keyframes, apart from our beginning one, and let me shrink our ship down just a little bit more. Got the Shift key down to constrain its proportions. Let me jump back to my previous keyframe with the J key and move this back a smidge. And let me hit Shift page down a couple of times to move forward about 20 frames, and I'll drag our ship down to about here, and I'll hit Shift page down a couple more times to go another 20 frames, and I'll drag it up here. Shift page down a couple more, and I'll drag it down here. Shift page down twice, 20 more frames up here. Shift page down twice more, and we'll go flying off screen. Okay. Now, we have kind of an irregular path. You can tell by the dots that the speed's changing on us a little bit. We'll talk more about that in just a sec. The more important thing is, how much of a pain would it be to sit and set all those rotational keyframes to try to simulate decent rotation of this throughout the entire course of this motion path? Well, the answer is a lot. It would be a lot of pain. It would be ridiculously silly, and we could tweak it all day and maybe never get it exactly the way we wanted it. Well, that's not true. There's ways to do that. But by far and away, the best thing you can do is take advantage of a wonderful built-in feature of After Effects, and you'll find it under the Layer menu, under Transform. What we're looking for is this last option, Auto Orient. There's also a keyboard shortcut for it, which is Control-Alt-O for Orient, or Command-Option-O. I prefer actually to just find it via the context menu. If you right-click on Windows or Control-click on the Mac, it's right here, just 4 items away from your layer itself, Transform, Auto Orient. And auto orientation by default is turned off. What we want to do is tell the layer to orient itself along the path. What this is going to do is automatically adjust the rotation of a layer so that it smoothly matches the curve of a motion path, which is a very cool feature. Click OK. Now we're pretty much lined up here. It's not bad. I can anticipate that we're going to be off by about 12 degrees. Why? Because we are off by about 12 degrees down here in the timeline. We weren't exactly straight before, so I'm going to adjust that back to 0 and see how it does by default. I think we have a little bit of a curve here. Now let me generate a quick RAM preview for this. Very quick. As you can see, we get great motion exactly along the vectors of the path. Kind of looks like one of those old games where you'd move a magnet along underneath a game board and the piece would follow along. Pretty cool. All right, a couple of things now to make this animation work better, because I'm all about making things work better. First of all, I'm going to up our quality. I'm going to turn that on. In fact, I'll turn it on for a background layer as well, which will smooth things out a bit. And I'm going to turn on motion blur for the layer, the egg layer that's moving. Won't do any good to turn it on down here on the space movie because there's no motion in that movie. And I'm going to turn on the motion blur switch here in the timeline. And I just threw something out there that's actually kind of important. This is completely a sidebar and has nothing to do with anything we've just done now. But I said there was no motion in the movie layer. And as far as After Effects is concerned, that's true. This motion blur switch is for geometric motion blur, where it calculates motion blur based on the movement of a layer. That doesn't mean any movement that's pre-rendered into the pixels. It only means movement around on the screen. Once you've got pixels burned into a movie, creating blur is a much more challenging process, and it's not something that you can do by simply turning on a motion blur switch for a pre-rendered movie. So that's why I said that earlier. This doesn't have any motion. The Earth may be rotating, but as far as After Effects is concerned, this layer is sitting still. So that's why it wouldn't do any good to turn on the motion blur. Anyway, now that we've turned on motion blur, let's take a look at our comp again and generate a RAM preview again. And you'll see we've got really cute, interesting, zippy motion. And the blur makes the motion that much more convincing. Now, a couple other things we can do here. I want to animate the scale to go along with our position, so it's as if the ship is flying out of the atmosphere. That's cool. I'll add scale by holding the Shift key down and typing the letter S, and that brings up our scale property. I'm going to hit Alt-S on Windows, Option-S on the Mac to add a keyframe for scale. Then I'll jump back to the beginning of our composition, and I'm just going to manually, up here in the comp window, scale our layer down with the Shift key. Now, here's an important thing. I want to constrain the scale of this layer with the Shift key, right? What you don't want to do is have the Shift key held down before you click on the layer. If you do, even if you're clicking on a control point, it's actually going to deselect the layer because the Shift key allows you to add to and subtract from a selection if you have it held down while you're clicking from object to object. The fact that I have the Shift key held down means I deselected this object, and another click means I'll select it again. Instead, I want to click on this corner first, then add the Shift key, then shrink our layer down to almost nothing. Generate a RAM preview again. You'll see our RAM preview generates a little more slowly than it did before, but it still generates pretty quickly. We get a much more fun animation of our ship zipping out of the atmosphere, completely out of control, on its way to parts unknown. Now, if you can accept the premise that anything like this could be realistic, I'm going to try to make this a little bit more realistic animation. For example, when something grows over distance, the perspective growth over distance, when something starts small and ultimately ends up large, it appears to grow very, very slowly when it's far away from you and grows increasingly larger faster the closer it gets to you. So I want to adjust the speed along the path here so that it's much slower at the beginning and much, much faster at the end. Right now, just based on the distance between keyframes, I've accomplished that to a degree. But what I'm looking to do is create a smoother transition between the different speeds. It's fairly subtle. Now, we've talked about how you have to achieve this by playing around down on the timeline, but I'm going to make a fairly extreme change just to illustrate a problem and then talk about the tools that After Effects gives you to solve it. Let's scoot our keyframes over to increase the distance between our two first keyframes, and that's going to really slow things down from here to here, and then things are going to get faster up here. Now, this again is an extreme move just to illustrate a point. Let's take a look in the comp window to see what that gives us. You can see now we have very slow motion at the beginning because our lines are close together, and then an abrupt switch to faster motion, slightly faster, slightly faster, slightly faster. If I preview that, you'll see that the results are not terribly satisfactory. It's not terrible, but it's not great. What we want to do is we want to be able to adjust the velocity along this path more gradually. And the way we do that is with the velocity controls that are available to us here in After Effects. We're going to come back to this layer in just a second. I want to now bring in a new piece and bring that piece on and use that piece to talk about the velocity controls. For the time being, let me actually turn off the visibility of our egg layer. And I'm going to bring in this slogan. That's smarts. T3V, that's smarts. It's another one of our little corporate slogans. And I want this to come into screen at this point. Oops, I've dragged it in at the wrong point in time, but I know a quick keyboard shortcut to fix that. We talked about it before. Alt-Home on Windows, Option-Home on the Mac. Pops that back to start at time 0, so we don't end up missing important information here at the beginning. Now let's go to about 2 seconds, and I want to animate the position of our layer. So I'm going to solo position, hold down the Alt key and type P to set a keyframe for position, jump home to take us back to frame 0, and now I'm going to drag this layer off screen. By now you should be familiar with the dots, telling us that we have nice smooth motion, reasonably quick, each dot representing a frame. And now I'm going to reveal something we haven't seen yet in After Effects. I'm going to go down to the word position and note that there's a twirly to the left of position, just like there's a twirly to reveal position in the first place. And when we twirl that open, it reveals some interesting information. It gives us a pixels per second readout that tells us our speed. That can be very, very useful. But it also gives us some weird little controls over here in the timeline. These controls are actually velocity controls for this layer. If I tap the plus key at the top of the keyboard to zoom in a bit more, let me actually grab this and zoom in by hand until we've spread our velocity controls for these 2 keyframes across this area. If I take a look at this dot, this blue anchor dot underneath our keyframe represents the value of the frame. The handle sticking out to the left is just like a Bezier handle up in the timeline. If you click and drag this handle down, you can actually control the speed of an object as a curve. So that in this case, lower being slower, our object starts out, accelerates a little bit, that's what that little bump is, and then over time, it gradually decreases into this final keyframe. As I'm adjusting this, look at the dots that you see up in the path. You'll see towards the right, towards its final destination, the dots are getting closer together, while to the left, they remain far apart. If I were to drag this up instead of down, you'd see that the dots are getting further apart close to the final destination, and the result of that, in that case, would be a speed up at the end. We don't want to speed up. We want to slow down. So I'll drag this down, and I'll even drag it to the left so that we get an even more gradual slowdown. This shape that we see right here is a visual representation of the speed of our object. If we don't want this little acceleration at the beginning, we'll have to grab this and drag it up until we're left with a smooth deceleration across the animation. And if I RAM preview that real quick, you'll see the results are our logo eases into place. Now, nothing tips people off to computer animation like abrupt changes in speed or abrupt changes in rotation without any ease at all. Things in real life don't tend to just immediately hit full speed and then just stop dead. Things just don't really move like that. Things often ease into their speed and they often ease out of their speed. And if they don't, they usually come to a violent end. So when you're bringing something in, it's very, very often preferable to add an ease to a keyframe to adjust the curve. Fortunately, After Effects gives us great tools to do just that. Let me select these keyframes. You'll notice the shape of these keyframes is different now. It looks kind of like an arrowhead pointing to the right. What this is really representing is a combination of Bezier in and standard keyframe out. Basically, this is 2 halves of a keyframe, a diamond on the right and the sort of dumbbell on the left. If I hold the Control key down on Windows or the Command key down on the Mac and click on these keyframes, I will toggle them to a state we haven't seen before, which is called Auto Bezier, which is a sort of an auto smooth form that gives us control handles but otherwise doesn't affect the layer speed. Another command click takes us back to our initial steady keyframes. Now this process of easing keyframes is so incredibly useful that they actually give you shortcuts to do it for you automatically, so you don't have to go in and twirl things down by hand. Let me jump to 1 second and set another keyframe for position. That's Alt-P. Basically, I'm stamping a keyframe down in the middle that doesn't have any real effect at this point because the velocity along this path is incredibly steady. And we both know that by just previewing it, and we can also see that the velocity line down here in the timeline is absolutely steady. It's a straight line that tells us that we don't have any change in speed at all. Straight line. But After Effects provides what are known as keyframe assistants, and keyframe assistants are actually plugins. You'll find them if you go digging around on your disk in your plugin folder. But keyframe assistants allow you to actually affect the values in keyframes in fun and interesting ways. And one of those ways is by providing shortcuts for creating an ease in an animation. Now, I added this extra keyframe because a couple of the ease values are specific to internal keyframes. In this case, a keyframe that has a value on either side of it. So what I want to do is apply these values, and I want you to watch what happens to the line that you see down there. You can find the keyframe assistants under Animation, Keyframe Assistant, and under this pop-up you'll see 3 values: Easy Ease In, and Easy Ease Out. It's very rare, in my experience, that you can't get by just choosing Easy Ease all the time, because almost never do you need one of these other elements. It happens sometimes, but almost never. Just to be thorough, I want to show you what they do. Watch what happens to the curve in the lower right-hand corner of your screen when I choose, for example, Easy Ease In. You'll see that the value eases in to the keyframe, so that the value gets really slow going into the keyframe, but it doesn't affect the value out of the keyframe at all. The results are going to look weird as it eases halfway through and then steadily proceeds to the end. Let me undo that. And Easy Ease Out is exactly the opposite. Now, I much prefer to do this by actually context clicking on the keyframe itself. I like entering values from the keyframe. If I right click on it on Windows, option click on the Mac, and choose Keyframe Assistant, I can now pick Easy Ease Out, and you should have been able to predict what that would do. It gives you steady motion in and then eases the motion out to the next frame. Again, not terribly useful. Control Z. What's much more useful is just a generic Easy Ease. It'll be kind of weird if we apply it in the center here, but again, I just wanted to even create this shortcut in the center to show you what the other 2 ease keyframes would do. If I preview this, you'll see we basically just end up with a dip in the center of our animation as it eases into the center and back out again. Instead, let me delete this keyframe now, and let me select our last keyframe and apply an Easy Ease. But now I'm going to do it the really easy way, not with any sort of pop-up menu at all, not with any right-clicking, not with nothing. All I'm going to do is hit the F9 key at the top of the keyboard. Function 9 automatically applies Easy Ease to any keyframe that you have selected. That's the shortcut you want to memorize. Easy Ease. Now we have a nice, smooth ease into our final position. That's coolness. All right. Now, before I apply this information to the path that we generated before, I need to explain a couple of other things about velocity controls in the timeline and why position is unusual compared to the other controls that we have. Practically anything else that we have keyframes for in the timeline behaves a little bit differently from position. I'm going to have to give myself a little more real estate so that we can see all of these next to each other and compare exactly what's going on. And I need another property to animate to make it a simple one-dimensional property like opacity. So let me add opacity by hitting Shift-T. Let me jump to the last keyframe that I currently have here. There we go. And set a keyframe for opacity. Jump home and drag our opacity value down to 0. Now, what does this velocity curve look like? Let me twirl open the velocity properties for opacity, and let's take a look at it. Now, this is what I was talking about. Position, down here in the timeline, has one velocity curve, but it appears that other properties have 2. Well, in fact, these are not 2 velocity curves. Only the bottom curve, the one with similar handles to what we saw before, is a velocity curve. And if we click and drag this to simulate the curve that we have up above, give us a same sort of general idea. It even gives us a bit of a Bezier line effect here, but this is not a velocity curve. This is actually a curve representing the values that result when you change the velocity. So this is actually telling us a readout of what our transparency numbers are, and this is telling us the speed of the change. Velocity has to do with speed. The value above it actually has to do with the values themselves that are the result of the change in speed. Why is this set up here and this not? Why is position only giving us the velocity but not actually giving us the values themselves? Well, it is. It's just that positional values are not represented in a graph down in the timeline. They're represented as a graph in the comp window. This line that we see right there is the value line that is the result of our velocity curve. The dots themselves are mapping values just as the value lines were mapped underneath opacity. The difference is, in the case of position, what we're seeing here is a line that represents positional information, and in the timeline we're seeing the result of temporal information. So this is temporal data, this is positional data. Both of these together give us animation. Now, this is not much of an interesting graph. It's a straight line where the dots get closer together. Let's take a look at a more complex graph by turning on our egg once again. This is a much more complex graph. And if we open up the positional properties for our egg and twirl down our positional data, you'll see our speed graph is all over the place. We have very slow speed from the first keyframe to the next. And then we have faster speed, a little bit faster, much faster. And then, of course, we're off screen, so it doesn't really matter. But this is not how a ship should move as it moves through a screen, right? We would really love to have this be a nice, gentle curve. And there's ways that you can try to do this manually. You could maybe select all of these intermediate keyframes and try an auto Bezier on them by control clicking and give us a Bezier curve. Well, that's not quite it, is it? It gives us a bit of a curve in our timeline, but it's still sort of stair-steppy. It's not the smooth curve that we would want to represent smooth motion through space. So what do we do? Let me control click back on this again to return our normal keyframes. What we have to do in a situation like this, where we've got our spatial information fixed, we don't want this to change. This is where we want the ship to go. But what we need to find a way to do is to intelligently move our keyframes back and forth in time to generate a predictable curve. But no matter how much I move these keyframes, I'm getting stair-steppy results. I'm getting absolute results from one speed value to another, to another, to another. Well, look at this little checkbox underneath these keyframes. This checkbox is only available to you with positional keyframes. You won't see this with any other kind of keyframes in After Effects. These checkboxes, when checked, are locking our keyframes into the position that you drag them, which is what you would expect. In most cases, I would think. You want keyframes to stay where you put them, right? Well, if you turn this X off, what you're telling After Effects is you're giving permission for this keyframe to move anywhere that it needs to move in time to result in steady motion between the frames on either side of it. This is otherwise known as allowing this keyframe to rove. And when I click on it, look, the X goes away, so does any data down here, and I end up with a straight line from here to here. So I've got smooth motion. Click on the next one. Now I'm smooth all the way through to the fourth keyframe. Select these next two and click on the X, and now I've got a smooth line from one end all the way to the other. Now, watch what happens. I can now click on this handle and adjust it, and I'm adjusting the motion and the speed of the motion all the way through this path, and the frames themselves are moving back and forth in time to accommodate this move. So, we can jump back to our beginning frame. I can ease into this move. I can basically have my ship moving slower at the beginning and get faster as it goes along, which is just what I wanted. And I can precisely control this velocity curve to be anything I want it by just adjusting the first keyframe and the last keyframe and allowing all of the other keyframes in the sequence to move. The result of that will be a much more realistic motion and scale. The motion is smooth along the course of the entire animation. I'm going to show you a couple of other practical uses for roving keyframes in just a second. But for now that we've gone to the trouble of generating fairly complex motion, and let me actually jump to a keyframe here and maybe, just maybe, make these curves a little less abrupt, because they are kind of sharp right now. You can just click on a keyframe and click and drag it. Be careful not to command click on a keyframe, because you'll toggle it to a sharp point. If you do that by accident and you want to get your curve back, just command click on it again and drag, and you'll drag out a smoother point. And move this around and adjust it. So now we have a little bit smoother transitions in our curves. That's good. Now that we've gone to all this trouble to create this motion path, there's all sorts of ways that you can make other objects move along the same path. You can copy and paste these positional keyframes. But for me, one of the funnest things I like to do is just duplicate the layer and then offset the copy of the layer in time a little bit. And the results in that case are you get animations where one object chases another around the screen. All we've done is created a copy, offset it in time. Now, once again, begging the question of what might actually be realistic or not, let's jump back a few keyframes, select this keyframe so we get the handles for it, and let's mess around with our Bezier handles a little bit. Maybe let our foreground element do some loop-the-loops while our background element is chasing him. And that gives us a flocking style animation where the two aren't exactly repeating each other's moves. So play around with this section. Make sure you understand what's going on. It's been a lot of information. Make sure that you really understand these concepts and that you can freely animate things around on screen and that you have at least a passing grasp on velocity curves and roving keyframes. Even pause the DVD now if you want to for a few minutes while you get some of these concepts stuck in your brain. And when you're ready, we're going to move on within this project to another composition where we're going to talk about hold keyframes. And the place that we'll find it is right here in the T3V Running Lights project. And let's take a look at what we have here. We have a couple of elements in the background. We have a T3V sign with lots of burned out light bulbs in it, and we have a single illuminated light bulb. Now I'm going to take this single illuminated light bulb, which is set to a transfer mode of lighten, by the way, so that it looks really pretty and turned on here. And I'm going to animate this around the letter T. I'm going to use a couple of tricks based on things that we've learned so far to create this animation. Now, we know that we want to work with position, so I'm going to type P for position, Alt-P to set a keyframe at a starting point. Now, what I really want this light to do is to jump from light bulb to light bulb all the way around this outline. What I've cleverly done in the Photoshop file that we're working with here is create a Photoshop file where all of these light bulbs are at least evenly distributed. They are all exactly as far apart from their neighbor horizontally or vertically as they are from a neighbor to the right horizontally or up and down vertically. They're all equidistant spread around this line in the case of this and the V. The 3 is more of a special case, but we're not even going to worry about that in this lesson. I'm going to zoom in a click here and use my hand tool to pan us down. So I can tell you that manually setting keyframes for all of this is out of the question. There's just too many of it and it'd be a complete waste of time because we can use After Effects built-in power to make this job a lot easier. I'm just going to hit Shift Page Down. It's a nice, easy value to work with. It's 10 frames. It's enough frames to see that something's going on. And I'm going to click and Shift drag this until it's over the next corner. All right? Now I know After Effects is automatically generating smooth keyframes. I can even see the Bezier handle here that it's producing on this first go around. And I don't want Beziers in this case. I want linear interpolation between these two keyframes. So I'm going to toggle a linear keyframe by holding down the Control key on Windows, Command key on Mac, and clicking. And now I've created a linear keyframe. I'm going to hit Shift page down again and drag, add the Shift key to constrain vertically, and you'll see I have a nice corner there. Now that I've done that once, every keyframe from this point on should be a corner keyframe, and the Shift key allows me to constrain this properly in the horizontal and vertical axis. Spacebar gives me the hand. Shift page down. Let's move this down to this corner. Shift page down. Move over to this corner. Once again, I'm being careful to lift up on the Shift key before I click, or I would deselect. Let me move this up a little bit. Add the Shift key. Now I'm constrained. Hand key to pan. Shift again to drag up here. Shift page down, 10 more frames. I'm going to drag over here, and one last Shift page down and drag, and I'm back at the beginning. And if I felt like it, just to ensure that I was exactly at the point that I started, I could copy my first keyframe, Control-C, and then paste, Control-V, Command-V on the Mac, and now I've pasted the exact value that I started with back onto this keyframe. Now if I hit the comma key to zoom back out and hit the space bar, you'll see that I'm after my animation, so I don't see anything. So I'm going to hit the home key to go back to the beginning, hit the space bar key, and you'll see that positional-wise, we're in good shape, but time-wise, we're all over the place. We got fast motion, slow motion, and no one should be surprised by that because each and every keyframe is set a third of a second from the one before it. Those are all predictable. Well, I didn't care about the timing of the keyframes because I know I can adjust those by using roving keyframes, and that's what I'm going to do now. What I need to do is select all of my keyframes for position, twirl open the timeline, zoom in a couple of clicks so we can see more clearly exactly what's going on. Just a couple's fine. And I'll click on the X below any one of these boxes, which will turn all of our keyframes into roving keyframes. And now a closer examination of our comp view will reveal that we now have a much more even distribution of our points around this path. Now I'll tell you, my goal in this animation is to time it so that I have one dot in the center of every one of these light bulbs. And I can pretty easily accomplish that now. Right now I clearly have a dot here, a dot here, a dot here, a dot here. So I have too many dots. I need to spread out the dots. How do I slow things down? Well, I either make things not move as far, and I don't have that choice of affecting things spatially because I have to actually be on top of the path that I'm at, or I can slow down my keyframes by spreading them out, having them take longer to get where they need to go. So I need to spread these out, but I want to spread these out in an easily applicable fashion. If I just hold down the Alt key or the Option key on the Mac and click and drag, yeah, I'm spreading them out, but I'm not seeing any live feedback in the timeline window until I let go. I need something that works a little more quickly to get the feedback that I need. So I'm going to deselect all of the keyframes and then select the last keyframe. And note that once these keyframes are roving, I am free to drag them wherever I want, and they'll all keep up with me. So I can adjust things pretty easily by just dragging this around or by nudging it around. Told you quite a while back that if you hold down the Alt key on Windows, Option key on Mac, and click left and right with the arrow tools, you can actually nudge the keyframe. So now if we look back in our comp window, I misspoke a second ago. I wanted to actually speed up my layers. That's what it means when they're moved apart. And I'll find that as I nudged my keyframes around, I'll eventually come to a magic point, and there it is. It's just under 2 seconds where I have a dot sitting on top of every single light in my composition. That's excellent. Let me zoom out one click by hitting my comma key, and here's a shortcut. Control-Shift-H, that's Command-Shift-H on the Mac, will hide all of my selection information on screen while keeping this layer selected. And now as I page down, you'll see each frame my light is moving forward one full light bulb, which is just great. But if I RAM preview this, let me jump out to 2 seconds or so and hit the N key to set a work area for just 2 seconds. And that way when we generate a RAM preview, you can see we sure enough have our light moving around the screen. But you know what? It doesn't look terribly realistic. Frankly, it's just moving too fast. And with the motion that we have here, I might as well have just kept it. You have no real sort of sense that the lights are appearing on every single light, even though when we go slow motion, you can tell that we are. It really doesn't matter. What I want to do is now slow this down. And I want to slow it down so it stays on a light for about 3 frames before it moves to the next light. So what we need to find a way to do is time stretch this, which isn't that hard, but time stretch it in such a way that we keep our keyframes. Well, I'm going to show you an incredible power shortcut right now that's way ahead of anything else that we're going to be talking about at this point in the series. But it is a shortcut that a lot of you are going to find very, very useful. First of all, let me jump to my end keyframe here, and I'm going to lay down a marker because I want to easily be able to find my way back to where I am right now. We haven't talked much about layer markers yet, but they're very, very useful in situations like this. A quick tap on the asterisk key adds this triangular-shaped marker on the timeline. Markers are extremely useful for marking significant points in time. You can click and drag them around if you need to adjust them. They move with the layer, so if we move the layer, the marker moves with it, which is very, very important. Comp markers don't do that. We talked about comp markers earlier on as well. If you need to label a marker, just a quick double click on it allows you to enter a comment, allows you to even enter URLs, frame targets, stuff that's very, very useful for creating web animations. But none of those things are important to us right now. We just need a marker so that we can tell exactly where our animation is supposed to end. Because the next thing I'm going to do is going to generate a ton of keyframes. Now, if you know what expressions are, great. This is a tip for something that you can do with expressions that's very useful. If you don't know what expressions are, don't freak out. I'm not going to get into expressions. I'm not going to get into code right now. I'm just going to quickly enable an expression for this layer, not one that does anything, but one that allows us to do something fun with keyframes. I'm going to select our positional property, and I'm going to go to Animation and choose Add Expression. It also gives you a keyboard shortcut, Shift-Alt =. Ignore this. By far, the quickest way to add an expression, in fact, I'm just going to ignore that pop-up altogether, is go back down into the timeline, hold the Option key down on the Mac, the Alt key on Windows, and just click on the stopwatch. That adds an expression. It adds a simple expression, position. Basically, what this expression, this piece of code, is now telling After Effects is our positional data is equal to our positional data. Basically, it's not doing anything, in other words. But I'm going to hit Enter and accept that expression because now, remember our friends, the keyframe assistants? Well, there's a really, really great one. If we right-click on Windows, Control-click on the Mac, and choose Keyframe Assistant, Convert Expression to Keyframes, we will now generate a keyframe on every single frame that we have, effectively stamping down the data that we've created. All right? Now, here's sort of a challenging part. I have to isolate the frames I want to keep from all these extra frames that After Effects just created that I want to pitch. And the way to do that is to make sure that all of my frames are selected. I'm going to click on the word position to select all of my keyframes. I don't need my expression anymore, so I'm going to Alt-click on the stopwatch again. That'll turn the expression off while keeping keyframes here. Don't just click on the stopwatch or all the keyframes will go away. So I've turned off the expression for this layer. Now I need to zoom in on my timeline a bit so I can see what I'm doing here. And now here's the tricky part. I need to deselect the keyframes that I want to keep up to the marker that we set earlier. So I'm going to Shift, drag from over here on the left-hand side where there isn't anything I'm accidentally going to click on. And I'm going to marquee drag out to the marker and let go. That should deselect everything I want to keep. Now if I hit the backspace key on Windows or the delete key on the Mac, that should get rid of all of my keyframes up to that point. So what I should have left myself with is one real keyframe for every frame of animation that I want to keep up here. And now all I should have to do is spread these frames out over time, right? And that will leave me with a nice animation of my lights stuttering around the sign the way I want them to. Well, almost. There is a pitfall to this, and I'll show you what it is. The first thing I want to do here, though, is point out that while I could select all of these and then hold down the Alt key on Windows, Option Mac, and drag this out to spread the keyframes out, I'm not going to be able to do that very precisely. I don't have an easily repeatable value. My marker here is at just like 2 frames under 2 seconds, so I would need to figure out what multiples of 1 second and 28 frames would be, and that's going to get not only tedious, but I'm liable to run into imprecise dragging. A better choice here would be to time stretch this layer. Now I realize a still doesn't have any inherent time base, it's just a still, but you can still use time stretch in a case like this to spread keyframes out. So that's what we're going to do. We wanted a keyframe for every 3 frames of animation. So what I want to do is actually time stretch this to 300%. So the quickest way to do that is to just click on this expansion bar at the bottom of the comp window here and enter a time stretch value of 300. We can see that that gets us a much, much longer result than we had before. Close this back down again. And now, sure enough, we have a keyframe every 3 frames. That's really great. However, if we look at our animation, and let me drag the timeline over, the hand tool works down here as well, which is really good to know. We drag our animation over so that we can see it on screen. The trouble is, After Effects does such a great job of interpolating between keyframes that our lights aren't exactly sticking on top of the light bulbs the way we want to. They're interpolating between the different frames. We've gone to all the trouble of creating this frame data, but it doesn't seem to have done us any good because our frames are not preserving the position data for our lights. Well, that's because they're just standard run-of-the-mill frames. In this case, they happen to be smooth frames, but it wouldn't matter if they were smooth or if they were linear frames. What we need is a different kind of frame here. We actually need to generate what's known as a hold keyframe. In After Effects, a hold keyframe will basically turn off interpolation between keyframes. It's really, really easy to do this. Let me drag out our timeline once again until we can see all of our frames. And since we're in Windows here, I'm going to marquee drag over the keyframes to make sure that they're all selected. Now, you can find hold keyframes up in the animation menu, but I don't want you to. Now that I have all of these keyframes selected, it's much, 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 much faster to simply context click on the selected keyframes, and the very first highlighted option available to you is toggle hold keyframe. That will turn these keyframes into hold keyframes. When I let go, they'll all switch. Let's zoom in a little bit to see what the hold keyframes look like. Well, they've got this little dumbbell view coming in, but going out, it's square. And the square keyframe is telling you that these are hold keyframes. A square is an indicator to you that no interpolation is happening now between these keyframes. And if I generate a RAM preview of this, we'll see that our work area doesn't extend far enough around the T to actually show the whole T, but you'll see that the motion we're getting now in the lights is much more believable as we hold 3 frames for each light. All right, so we know this is going to go all the way around. We know we're in good shape for one loop. What do we do next? Well, the next bit I'm going to show you is actually pretty advanced stuff. So hold on to your hats, and I hope you find this interesting. What we're going to do here is create a staggered animation. And by a staggered animation, I actually mean that we're going to create multiple copies of this light layer for every light that we want running around the screen. And we don't need a light for every single light bulb here because only 1 out of every 3 lights is going to be lit at the same time. But I am going to need to make a bunch of duplicates of this layer. I think, all told, I need about 16 layers to make this work. And our first step will actually be to select all of our positional keyframes and copy them. And I'm going to shift drag to this last frame and paste. And that's going to give us 2 entire loops of our animation to work with. Because we need more than 1 loop around to create these kinds of chasing style animations. The next thing I'm going to do is actually drag our work area out to our marker, and that's going to set our work area to what we ultimately want 1 full loop to be, although that work area won't stay here at the beginning of this layer. All right? So now that I've done that, now that I've created this little masterpiece, I'm going to do one more thing, and that is I'm going to jump to the point in time where I'm going to want my next layer to come in. And let's say right there on that frame where the light bulb appears in this place, I want another light bulb to appear back here. In fact, I'm going to go 1 more frame forward just to stagger things a little bit more and let the lights sort of blink a little more out of sequence. Some of you this may make sense, some of you it won't, but my next step here is to trim this layer. I'm going to hold the Alt key down and hit the right bracket key. And I've now, even though I've left all of these keyframes in place, I've generated a single layer that's only 10 frames long. Okay, close this layer up. The layer selected, I'm now going to duplicate it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 times. When you're doing this from scratch, you're going to have to experiment with the numbers of layers that you want to duplicate. Because if you're mathematically disinclined like I am, you're going to have to do a little bit of experimenting. But it only takes a little to figure out exactly what the right mix is. Right now I know we have 16 copies of our lights. Oops, it actually turns out we have 17, and I don't need 17. I made 16 copies, but I can delete the top one because I need 16 total, I believe. This is going to work out okay. So I've selected my top layer. I'm shift selecting my bottom layer. Now I'm going to use another really cool keyframe assistant. Now this keyframe assistant is so cool that you don't even have to have a keyframe selected to use it. I'm just going to right-click on any layer that's highlighted. You see, while we have our keyframe assistant pop-out available to us, there's only one selection in here that's active now, and that selection is Sequence Layers. And watch what happens when I choose this. Well, first of all, we're given a pop-up that allows us to set some options. We're just going to accept the defaults and click OK. And now note all of our layers have been sequenced in the timeline so that they butt up back to front. This one plays 10 frames, then the next one starts and plays 10 frames, then the next one starts 10 frames, and so on and so on and so on. They're all chasing each other in time 10 frames apart. Now, if I was to just RAM preview this at this point in time, you wouldn't see much of anything interesting. You would just see the same lights blinking over and over again. That's not going to do us much good at all, is it? Nope. However, this is where it gets fun. If I move my timeline marker now to the end of this composition, and with all of my light layers still selected, I use a keyboard shortcut I talked about earlier to trim our layers and trim our layers back out again. That's Alt right bracket. I've now extended all of our layers back out, and if we scroll back into the middle, look what we got. We got little lights chasing each other around the screen. Very, very cool. Because we added that one little frame, they kind of chase each other in a staggered way that I really like. Now let me zoom out on my timeline so I see the whole thing. And we know that one full loop has been defined by our work area up here because that's how we set up our initial timing. If I just drag this work area out to a point where the last light is on screen, and I drag this work area out so it starts there, this is why I created 2 full loops, because now even with the stagger, I have enough animation on screen to fill this up throughout the course of the work area, and at the end of the work area, I should have a fully looping animation. Let's RAM preview this. Just take a second. And there we go. We got ourselves some running lights that look realistic. They look interesting, look like Vegas, very fun. And you've learned a staggered animation technique that's going to be incredibly useful for you for tons of different kinds of animations down the road. Now your homework is to repeat this process on the V, and then for extra credit, if you feel like it, you can create an animation up here in the 3, although we don't have the blessing of the evenly spaced dots on the 3 that we have elsewhere, but you might have fun animating lights around this path up here as well. The trick to the V is that you have a corner in the upper left-hand corner, you have another corner here, you have 2 corners down here, and then a corner here, 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 and then come back to the beginning. Add keyframes at each of these corner points, rove the keyframes, adjust the timing until you have a dot on top of every light bulb, time stretch things out, convert it to hold keyframes, tweak from there, duplicate the layers, etc., etc. Now the end result of all this is you're going to have an awful lot of layers down here that are variations on your light 1 layer, but that's okay. You're going to need to learn to work in applications that have tons and tons of layers. Remember though, if things get hard to handle at any point in time, you can take a bunch of layers that you're done animating, for example, these light layers that we have here, make them shy, turn on the shy switch, and now suddenly our composition is much, much easier to handle. Okay? You'll need to unshy that to make a copy of your lights, etc., to continue working from this point on. But there you go. That's your homework. Now, before you do that, I want to jump back to our space scene and talk about 1 or 2 more quick things before we end this lesson altogether. We just sort of introduced the concept of time stretching a still. Well, obviously you can time stretch movies as well, and we have an issue to contend with here in this composition that I've already talked about. And that is the fact that our space movie is actually playing backwards. If this is the planet Earth, it needs to be spinning in the other direction. you will often come up with elements in a composition that need to play at different speeds. It's a very simple thing to speed something up and slow something down by simply changing its time stretch value. But there's other times you actually need to make things play backwards, and this is one of those cases. The quickest way to make a layer go backwards is to memorize its keyboard shortcut, which is Control-Alt-R on Windows, Command-Option-R on Mac. And you'll see when you invoke that keyboard shortcut that you get a nice visual feedback here in the timeline that things are not exactly moving as expected. You get these slash marks, this sort of warning actually in the bar here telling you that your clip is actually set to run at a negative speed. These bars aren't exactly telling you that you're necessarily running at minus 100%, but they are telling you that you're running at a negative speed, which is very important. Let me undo that and show you that you can also evoke this value and have the exact same results, albeit with a little more work, by using the time stretch values. If we open up time stretch, a stretch value of negative 100% will have exactly the same result as the keyboard shortcut that I just mentioned to you. With one exception, the keyboard shortcut that I just showed you has the advantage of leaving the layer where it is in the timeline. The time stretch value, on the other hand, allows you to freeze the layer in point, which in our case is absolutely no good because our layer in point is on the first frame of the composition, and that means the entire movie would play off the pasteboard left, which is absolutely no good. While we're actually successfully reversing our movie, if we click OK, you can see pretty clearly that our movie is now playing in the wrong direction on the timeline and is, in fact, therefore invisible to us most of the time. So we'll undo that. The layer out point is going to give us basically the same problem, only at the end of the comp. The other option is the one to choose, and that's current frame. If I select current frame, once again hit a negative 100% value and click OK, you'll see the rotation occurred around the current frame where we were in the timeline, and at least I can see my clip. It's not exactly where I want it to be, but I can now drag it over in the timeline, and there I've got a time reverse clip. Oops, when I go home, I realize that I'm actually clipping off a frame, so I need to scoot this over in the timeline a little bit. And now a quick hit on the space bar, and we've got our results. That's all very good. If we check out how that looks, you'll see, yep, that worked. The planet is now happily spinning in the proper direction as our ships kind of chase themselves out of the scene. So we've covered tons of ground here. There's an awful lot in motion. There's a lot to understand. There's a lot to play with. There's a lot of fun to be had, though, which I hope you will. I also hope that you will take me seriously when I give you homework. I think the concepts that you reinforce when you go back over this Running Lights project are going to go a long way towards helping you understand how to effectively use time and repetition to create some really, really impressive sequential animations. And the end result should be a really, really cool blinking T3V logo and something that you can be proud that you've created. In the meanwhile, by all means, have fun.